I've heard of golden retriever husbands, but boy, does this guy take the cake. Welcome or welcome back, everybody, to Fiends and Final Girls. I'm your host, Meg. This is our little corner of YouTube to talk about all of the chaos and weirdness that comes with being a horror fan. Today we're taking a look at the brand new release of Wolfman. Not the Wolfman, Wolfman. Very distinct difference in the title. This is Leigh Whannell's take as writer and director on the Wolfman character and lycanthropy stories. It was produced by Blumhouse, distributed by Universal, and one of our first horror films of 2025. Friday, I went to check this thing out, took myself to lunch, took myself to the theater. It was a fairly quiet theater experience. There was only a handful of us there, which I was kind of expecting. I wasn't expecting this thing to be a blockbuster by any means. It is a January horror film, so I went in with tempered expectations, but cautiously optimistic because Leigh Whannell had such success with The Invisible Man and with the Saw franchise. I was very curious to see what he could do with this one. Wolfman, it stars Julia Garner from last year's Apartment 7A, the Rosemary's Baby prequel. She plays Charlotte. Christopher Abbott as Blake. You might recognize him if you were one of the 12 or so people who went and saw Craven the Hunter back in December of 2024. Sam Yeager from The Handmaid's Tale plays Grady, Blake's dad, and also stars Matilda Firth, who plays Ginger, which is a not so subtle nod to another werewolf franchise, Ginger Snaps, which it took me a minute to catch on to that one, but I really appreciated that cute little Easter egg that we named the daughter of the piece, the child, Ginger. One of the only female werewolves in film. So my theater experience having been as quiet, I guess, as it was, I was by myself. I didn't have husband or children with me to see this one. I wasn't sure if anybody else cared enough to come with me, so I went by myself. I think that helped in my experience quite a lot because I was able to really focus on the film. I didn't have anybody in my ear. I was able to dial in and really pay attention to what was on the screen. For me, I feel like when I'm watching a movie, that makes all the world of difference, is to be able to not have my attention pulled in a bunch of different directions. I'm not on my phone. I don't have anyone trying to get my attention at home, especially with a movie like this one where it was very much a slow burn film. Not having any distractions, it helps a bunch. I'm pretty sure that is what made the difference for me anyway. I'm going to do my best to avoid any serious spoilers, but this is your warning now. If you haven't seen the film yet and you plan on seeing it anytime soon, in the off chance I slip up and goof or I don't know what your definition of a spoiler is, feel free to come back later to get my thoughts and opinions on the movie after you've seen it. This is your one warning to click the video off now and then come back when you're done. If you are not a fan of slower paces or much more careful, deliberate pacing in movies, you're going to be bored to tears. If you don't have the patience for movies that don't have a ton of dialogue, you're not going to love this one. It's a lot of building of tension. It's more of a character study is the best way I can describe this thing. So if you're much more of a plot, action, gore, kind of grindhousey, this is not for you. If you're into more of a slasher type of film, this isn't for you. This is very much an exercise in character exploration. It is an exercise in broken family dynamics. It also does play into an isolation element as well, with being out in the woods and having nothing but vast forest around you. It is very much in the vein of something like maybe The Shining, where you're dealing with minimal characters, minimal dialogue, and wide open spaces or tiny cramped cabin spaces. That's the warning for people who have been finding this thing to be a bit boring. Wolfman takes place over one single night. The focus of the story is on the transformation itself. So whereas your traditional werewolf film, the transformation is only a piece of the overall film, Wolfman actually makes it the entire focus. So what you're getting is all of the nitty-gritty gory details as to what a person goes through once they are afflicted with the lycanthropy disease. I guess we'll call it a disease because it's transmitted through bites and scratches. So bloodborne illness. The bulk of the film, it takes place with a family trapped in a house, isolated in the woods. There's no working vehicles, there's no power. They don't have a phone signal. I think that's a common thing now, where we are constantly wired and connected to each other with cell phones and the internet and everything else. You have to put characters like this, for a story like this, in a place where they don't have that as an option. The film opens with a father and son going on a hunting trip. They live in the middle of nowhere, Oregon, and this is where we sort of first get the tease of the creature. We don't actually get to see anything more than a little bit of condensation from an animal breathing into the cold air. Father's name is Grady. He's a military veteran and has chosen specifically to live life off the grid with his son. And he only communicates by radio. The beginning of this movie takes place in the mid-90s, so there really wasn't the option for, I mean, it was limited, but there was really no options for cell phones or the internet at the time. But he didn't even have a landline phone. Grady only communicated via radio, and those were the people who also lived off the grid that were in the area as well. There's a point where after the hunting trip is over, Grady realizes that he saw the legendary Wolfman. It feels a bit Sasquatchy because Grady got a glimpse of the Wolfman, proving the legends were true, so he had to go get this thing. We flash forward almost 30 years to present day, where Blake is now living in a city. It doesn't say specifically what city. I'm under the impression it's Los Angeles, but we flash forward. Blake now is married, has a child. He's living in a city. He went from living off the grid with nobody to living in an apartment where there's always people around. So he went from one extreme to the other. We get a great foreshadow going on of communications breakdown between Blake and his wife and his daughter at the beginning of it, which sort of foreshadows what happens towards the end of the film when Blake is going through his transformation. Flash forward decades at this point, and Grady has no contact with his dad. He lost contact with him when he left. He would have been able to contact Grady if he tried, because his dad has been missing for decades. And so the whole movie actually kicks off when Grady gets word that his dad has now been pronounced deceased by the state. He's been a missing person long enough, and he has to go back to Oregon to deal with his father's affairs and whatever belongings that were in the house, etc. They end up in Oregon in a moving truck to go deal with what needs to be dealt with. A childhood friend of Blake's helps to get Blake and his family to his father's house. He sees something in the road, tries to swerve his moving truck around it, ends up going over a cliff, getting caught in a tree. As we're going through, we're getting glimpses of the monster. This is where Blake gets scratched. This is where he gets injured by the wolf creature. So the rest of the movie from here on out is seeing the slow and steady transformation of Blake and the effect it has on his family. And what I think is super cool about this movie is not only is it a unique take focusing strictly on the transformation of the afflicted person, it also shows you what it does to the family. We don't really get a ton of that, at least direct point of view of what happens with the family. The focus is usually on the werewolf character itself and the damage that they cause running amok. Because this is an isolation film, we are fully immersed in the breakdown of the character with lycanthropy and the breakdown of their family as they're watching a loved one succumb to what's essentially an illness. Leigh Whannell did direct this as well, and I think he did a very good job of channeling a little bit of Cronenberg's The Fly. It was that sort of progressive thing where it's like, oh, a tooth fell out, or the senses start to change, or a little bit of the hair starts to fall out or grow, or small changes that are happening throughout the movie. And every time we flash back to Blake, we get to see him a little bit further along using the makeup, which is also really cool to see. It's not like American Werewolf in London where you see the transformation just over the course of a few minutes. It's not like the traditional Wolfman movie where it's kind of over and done with very quickly. It takes place over the course of several hours. So we get Blake's transformation, we get the breakdown of his family, we get to see a couple of Easter eggs, winks and nods to other films. There's even one of the 2010 Wolfman movie. I think it's really nice that Leigh Whannell gave a little bit of respect to a movie that really doesn't get a whole lot. Like, let's be frank, the 2010 Wolfman film gets shit on a whole bunch. One of the big plot points as well that is worth kind of taking a moment to look at is Charlotte, his wife. Cutting back and forth between the focus of what's going on with Blake and what's going on with Charlotte really adds a little something to the movie. We get to see Charlotte go through all of the stages of grief over the course of an hour and 42-minute film. Starting off with denial of my husband's not even sick, going all the way through to acceptance at the end, literally at the end of the movie when fate is sealed. Charlotte's a pretty tough chick. I did see Apartment 7A last year. Julia Garner is a really good actress. She did a great job of portraying a very sympathetic person who might have been a bit detached from her husband because of life in general, stressful job, having kids, the whole bit. But what was supposed to be a trip that was going to reconnect them ended up being the trip that finally destroyed them completely in the end, which is super sad if you put a little bit of thought into it. Leigh Whannell, having put his own spin on the werewolf legend, tale, whatever you want to call it, having him do that, I think made for a very unique werewolf movie experience. It was definitely one that was a little different than anything I had ever seen. We could have just gotten another remake of the Lon Chaney Jr. Wolfman film. So up until this point, I haven't bothered seeing any other of my favorite reviewers' takes on this movie. I've seen them coming out. I've seen the thumbnails on YouTube. I've been very careful about avoiding all of those because I have my opinion, but I don't want it colored by what somebody else has seen. So this is as honest a take as I can give you. So on to the positives, of which there are some, focusing solely on transformation and the effects the transformation has, all of the elements that go into it, and getting to almost fully immersed into the transformation ourselves as an audience member was a super positive. Full disclosure, the original Wolfman is not one of my favorites. It never really has been. I found it to be a bit boring. So seeing derivatives of that over my entire life in one way or another, it's nice to see something that's not that. Wolfman doesn't follow any of the traditional tropes or beats that normally you would see in a werewolf film. There's no full moon, there's no silver bullets, there's no transforming back and forth. Once you are afflicted, it's permanent. You do your transformation and then you are no longer able to become human again, which again is a nice take on it, because whether other werewolf films are full moon, the full moon forces it, or it's more of a shapeshifter vibe where the character can shift back and forth between their beast form and their human form at will, having to be permanently stuck as essentially half man, half animal sounds like a fate worse than death to me. Honestly, that was probably the thing that kind of weirded me out the most, was I don't have the option to be me again. I'm just this creature this bloodthirsty creature that just runs around out in the woods, and I don't have any control over my body. And even though I may still have a human brain with thoughts and feelings, it's trapped inside of this monster. There are certain diseases we actually deal with, like ALS or those sorts of things, where the body starts breaking down and changing, but you're still you inside your own head, which sounds terrifying. It sounds awful. My heart goes out to people who have either been afflicted with it or know people and have dealt with people who have been afflicted with something like that. So this version of the Wolfman kind of toys with the idea of these terminal degenerative illnesses, and it's something that you can't come back from. The only solution is death. As somebody who is a fan of horror films from the 70s and 80s, I have a soft spot in my heart for practical effects. Wolfman is very heavily practical effect driven. It's makeup, it's practical effects. Like if a tooth falls out, it's a tooth. You don't have to see computer generated blood or any of that stuff. When there's a shift in the body or a change in facial structure, we get to see a bladder pump out cheeks, makeup cheeks, and you get to see the bones shifting under Blake's skin when his transformation is more ongoing. I love that this was probably at least 95% practical makeup and special effects with a slight CGI enhancement in a couple of places, just to maybe ratchet up the gore just a little bitty bit, This isn't a super gory movie, but if it needed just a little bit of oomph, I feel like there was a little bit of CGI in a couple of places, but not so much to be distracting or to really notice. That's just something that maybe I've observed, but if this was 100% practical makeup and effects, then good on the filmmakers, because that is a dying art form. And along the same lines, it's a super unique look for our Wolfman in this movie. He's not super hairy. It's not a nod to Jack Pierce. It's not a nod to any of the underworld wolfies where we have basically an anthropomorphic wolf, a dog that stands up on its hind legs and maybe moves around a bit more like a man than an animal, but it's still very doggy in nature. This is very much a man that has taken on canine features. It looks very grotesque in that way. It's not, the creature's not super hairy. This might be one of those things that if you're a traditionalist, this is not going to be your thing. I'm looking for an artist's unique interpretation of what they want their monster to look like. Finally, for the positives, probably the coolest part of the whole thing is being immersed in the transformation. We get to experience a lot of things through Blake's point of view. So there's points throughout the movie where his hearing is enhanced. For example, there was one scene where he hears something scrambling around upstairs on the second floor of the house, and he's going searching for whatever this thing is, and he opens up a closet door, and there's a wolf spider, about yay big. There's a wolf spider crawling around on a closet. And I don't know about you, but I generally don't hear spiders just crawling up a wall. Not only did you get to experience what Blake experienced, but you got to experience it fully because it was excessively loud. It wasn't just tapping. It was almost elephant stomping going on. And as he got closer to the closet door and actually opened it, you could hear the swelling of the sound effects. So when you're in the theater, it basically, or at least in my theater, I don't know, mileage may vary here, but in my theater, it enveloped me entirely, what Blake was hearing. There's scenes where you can see his vision changing, and he can see colors that we can't, and he can see lights that we can't, and he's getting much more of that nocturnal canine vision. Probably one of the most unique, and I keep using that word because that's the best way I can describe this movie. Probably one of the most unique and coolest parts of it is the breakdown of communication that was foreshadowed at the beginning of the movie between Blake and his family. When Charlotte or Ginger are talking to him and we are immersed in Blake's point of view, you can hear the language, the way they're speaking, getting garbled. He's not understanding what they're saying. He's having to pick up on visual cues and those sorts of things rather than the words that they're actually speaking. And we hear that. We hear their voices become a bit muffled and it sounds like gibberish. It's muddied language. Some scenes that were really cool where the camera would swing around, so we would get Blake's point of view and then we would swing back around a little bit and then come back around to audience point of view where we can see and hear everything normally that Blake can't, or it's what Charlotte and Ginger are hearing as well. We're also seeing a lot of going through more of the gradual changes of teeth falling out and claws growing and fingernails popping off. If you're somebody who's squeamish about things like teeth and fingernails and boils on the skin and other skin afflictions, I guess, you're gonna be grossed out by some of the scenes in this movie. The pace of the movie doesn't quite ratchet up until probably the last 20 minutes or so of it, but once it really kicks off, it really kicks off with the chasing and the fighting and the trying to escape and everything else that goes along with it as we're building to the climax of this movie. If you've held on that long, I think your patience is being rewarded towards the end of it. I guess it's on to the negatives at this point. The first negative, and it's kind of a big one, is there were parts of this movie that were essentially too dark to see. It just wasn't very well lit in a lot of places, which was frustrating. Being able to, like, something is going on and you can see highlights, but they're being drowned out by the shadows. The bulk of this movie takes place at night, which is great, but there's so many movies that take place at night that we can actually see what's going on. Even if we're lighting by candlelight, we could see something, but this one, it felt like you needed night vision goggles to get through a fair chunk of it. There was no way to get a clear-cut view as to what was going on in front of you, which is a damn shame, because I'm sure there was something cool happening or something interesting happening, but what was it? Another potential negative, this is also a mileage may vary type of situation, but I put this one in the negative column because traditionalists and werewolf enthusiasts might not like the wolf look in this movie because it is so different and it's not hairy and it's built more like a grotesque mutated man rather than an anthropomorphic wolf. There's going to be a lot of people that hate this thing. It's just the nature of the beast, pun intended. And finally, the slower pace and minimal dialogue is definitely going to bother a lot of audience members. It's going to be something that most people are going to be bored to tears with. If you're a fan of like a Rosemary's Baby, if you're, well, I guess I could say Polanski's movies in general, or Kubrick's movies, or those sorts of things, you're probably more likely to have the patience for the pacing of this film. Scrolling through my YouTube feed, there's thumbnails where I get to see a couple of different things, and one of the main things that keeps coming up is this is dull and it's boring and it's slow and blah blah blah. And yes it is slow. There is no secret that this movie is slow as hell. But can you hang for non-horror fan type things if you're into something more like, say, Outlander, where you get a bit more world building? Again, slower pace, a lot of day-to-day, don't really have a ton going on between the action sequences and the fights and the sex, and there's huge swaths of show and book, it's both, huge swaths of show and book where you're just going about day-to-day stuff. If that's up your alley, cool, it's going to work out well for you. So overall, my final thoughts on this thing, this is a 4 out of 5 star movie for me. It could have maybe been like 4.25, 4.5 if I could actually see what was going on through a fair chunk of it. Thankfully, it's more towards the back end of the movie during the third act. If it was most of the film where it was so bathed in darkness I couldn't really see what was going on, I'd have hated this thing. I would have not, my patience would have quit ages before the movie did. But for an hour and 40 odd minutes, I think it's a good watch. It's a movie that swung for the fences. Did it strike a home run? Not quite, but I think it got to second or third base on this one. And it doesn't do what it's necessarily expected to do, which is also something that I appreciate. Trying to go with that go big or go home idea. There's always an upside to following tradition, but I think there's a bit more value in maybe sidestepping it just a little bit and trying something new. The actors do a good job of showing the experience of pain and grief and sadness and just the full breaking down part of being a human. Maybe Wolfman doesn't need the full theater experience. If I wasn't trying to do this YouTube channel, I think it could have waited for streaming and I would have been perfectly happy with it. But I'm not upset that I spent my $9.50 to go see this thing on a Friday afternoon. Am I getting a lot of rewatchability out of this movie? Only time will tell. But for right now, I think it's worth a watch. Give it a shot, but it is going to be, for sure, a love it or a hate it movie. So what do you guys think? Kindly discuss your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like what you saw, click on any of the recommended videos, subscribe, click the bell to get notifications whenever a new video drops. And we'll see you fiends and final girls in the next episode.